So, another religious twat asked me to look at a video that would surely convince me of the existence of a god. The video is by the channel Defense of Sanity, who seems to have died soon after releasing this video, though I probably shouldn't throw stones from my glass house of not having released the video in over a month at time of writing. On the topic of time of writing, it's currently 20 past midnight when I'm starting my first draft. So this will be fun.
Does God exist?
Nope. Well, that was a quick one. This has been Phoenix. Nah, just kidding.
An Aristotelian proof. So a common argument you hear for God's existence is based on accounting for where everything we see came from in time.
Where everything came from in time. So this is all after the Big Bang, as the Big Bang was the first moment. Keep this in mind when he wants to start talking about things like outside of time, because it kind of makes it all gibberish.
For example, I came from my parents, and they from theirs, and so on. You'll hear arguments say that the chain can't go on forever, and there must have been a God to start the whole process.
Sure, you've heard it said. But have you seen it supported? I too can make claims. Unless you can support your claim, they can be discarded like my claim that I have a spaceship in my backyard.
However well-meaning, this approach is flawed. I believe Aristotle provided a more solid approach, which I'll now present with several additions and clarifications.
Color me surprised. Really thought they would go for the ship no regression can be infinite argument. Now I'm intrigued. Don't disappoint me now. Spoiler alert. They are going to disappoint me. They are going to say that no regression can be infinite. They're just pointing at a slightly different example.
So why is that approach flawed? Mostly because even though my existence can be accounted for by pointing to my parents, they are no longer required to account for my existence right here and now. Even if they pass away, my existence can persist.
That is a good point, and a strong point against anyone that claims that the universe requires a supernatural cause and thus God must exist. Even if the universe did require a supernatural cause, that cause could have ended or died at the start of the universe. There could have been a God that started the universe, but that God no longer exists.
Philosophers would call this sort of causal chain ordered per accidens, or a horizontal causal chain. We technically can't rule out that such a chain does regress to infinity, because every link in the chain doesn't strictly require appeal to a previous member in order to account for its existence here and now. What we need to consider is a vertical chain of causation that accounts for things here and now. Imagine a coffee cup sitting on a table. What keeps it from falling to the floor? The table supporting it underneath. Well then, what keeps the table from falling downward? The foundation of the house underneath.
At time of writing, I'm really interested if they keep this going, because you'll end up with the center of the Earth. What does it stand on? Oh yeah, nothing. The Earth doesn't rest on anything. It happens to be falling towards the sun, but that's completely separate. Though an analogy isn't bad because it's not a perfect mirror. Otherwise, it would just be the thing, no longer an analogy.
Well then, what keeps the foundation stable? The Earth below. Now you can see we have a causal chain whereby each member strictly requires appeal to a previous member in order to account for its circumstances here and now. If the table passes away, the coffee cup comes crashing down. Its position above the ground here and now is a power derived from previous members of the chain in a way that my presence here and now isn't derived from my parents. Philosophers would call this sort of vertical chain ordered per se. It is this sort of chain that cannot regress to infinity.
Why not? What makes it so that this can't have an infinite chain? Sure, it may seem unintuitive, but so is the nature of quantum physics. Unintuitiveness is irrelevant. Can you show it can't regress infinitely?
Eventually, you must reach a first member of the chain which imparts causal power to the rest of the members, but which itself does not receive causal power. But what caused this first member?
So, no support for why it can't be an infinite chain. And of course, I would love to see what they think needs to return to God in such a chain.
This objection comes from the assumption that all things must have a cause.
Neat that they say it's an assumption. Would be nice if they put that in the conclusion somewhere, that it is all built on an assumption, but oh well.
But remember, the whole point of this argument is that it cannot be true that all things must have a cause.
Okay, so the assumption that all things must have a cause is false. Quantum physics, for instance, with virtual particles that I talked about in my video on the Kalam, support this.
That leads to an absurdity. The force of this argument is that there has to be at least one thing which doesn't itself require a cause, or causal chains become nonsense. If we saw a gear turning, and we asked what was moving it, one could say the previous gear. If we asked what caused that gear to move, one could say the one before it. You could keep going this way for a while, but eventually you have to stop at something that does not derive its moving power from something prior.
Of course, movement ultimately doesn't need a cause. Let's not forget Newton's first law of motion. An object in motion will stay in motion unless acted upon. If there was never a time where there was no motion, then no force was ever needed to put the first gear into motion. It could simply always have been in motion.
To suggest this is as absurd as to suggest that a series of gears can move themselves so long as you have enough gears in the series, infinitely many. Let's pause briefly to consider how causation in this way works. Whenever any change occurs, it is always preceded by a potential to change in that way.
Oh hey, it's the thing I just touched on. Now I personally dislike the wording of potential and actual, so you may see me avoiding it. Probably my autism being weird, or just me being weird. The latter is more likely. Basically, they're probably going to be saying that every change requires a change before that, and that there must have been a first changer. Except not really. All change is energy in motion on some level. And Newton's first law already told us that motion doesn't need a mover if it was never at rest to begin with.
For example, before a match is lit, it merely has the potential to be a flame. Once enough energy is generated at the match head, that potential becomes actual. But no change ever occurs without the potential to change, followed by the actualization of that potential. Now, potentials don't exist by themselves. You don't just have a potential to be a flame absent of anything capable of causing flames. Potentials require actualizers to exist, and a potential plus the power to actualize that potential isn't inherently found together in a single thing, or else that potential would just always be actualized. The power to actualize a potential is external.
Oh really? So, nothing actualizes its own potential. So if I have a particle that has the potential to turn into another particle, it will never actualize that potential without outside influence. That is what they're saying. But if that's true, radioactive decay wouldn't be a thing. That is a particle that have the potential for change that actualize their own change. In 5,730 years, a carbon-14 atom has a 50% chance to actualize its own potential of turning into a nitrogen-14 atom. How about virtual particles that don't exist and have the potential to exist, that actualize their own existence? Seems like this assumption that nothing can actualize its own potential isn't warranted either.
Finally, when we say potential, we don't mean literally every conceivable thing that could happen. A match doesn't inherently have the potential to fly to the moon, although you could give it that potential by strapping it to a spaceship, and that potential would then be actualized by the rockets, which are actual. All of this potential actual talk may either sound strangely abstract or commonsensical, But either way, it's a reliable description of reality and holds up predictably when we observe the universe. It may be abstract, but it can be known inductively by observing nature.
I personally find it needlessly complicating. And I do programming. Abstraction is literally my profession. Alongside Googling.
A causal chain ordered per se is just a series of members actualizing the potentials in subsequent members. And by the way, in this example I keep showing, the ultimate first member of the series can't be the Earth, since the Earth derives its power to prop up the rest of the series from electron repulsion and other factors. But those factors themselves appeal to yet prior factors, but this series too cannot regress infinitely, as we have seen.
As we have seen? Where? I watched the whole thing again. They never show this. They assert it, but it's not shown. I've given multiple examples of things that actualize their own potential. As far as we're aware, of course. Their assumption that something can't actualize its own potential simply isn't warranted.
So when we say that these sorts of chains must have a first member that does not receive causal power from a preceding member, we are saying that this first member must lack potency. It's just purely actual. Think about it. If the first member had any potency, and potencies don't exist without external actualizers, then there would have to be something actual external to the first member which accounts for the potential in the first member. Not that this is a problem, but then whatever that external actual is, it must lack potency, or if it had any potency, then it would require an actual external to itself, and so on.
This runs into two problems. First problem, this all plays out over time.
But no change ever occurs without the potential to change, followed by the actualization of that potential.
Time is not an infinite thing. The Big Bang was the first moment. As far as I'm aware, the Big Bang couldn't be actualized, as there was no time to actualize the Big Bang in. Now, my personal explanation I see for how the Big Bang happened lies in Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Since in a zero-dimensional space the exact position and momentum of all energy is known, things must change to allow for the uncertainty that's required. But that's just my personal idea. Not particularly backed up by anything, but pretty layman knowledge of quantum physics. Though, layman knowledge of quantum physics may be a contradiction in terms. Second problem. Even if the potential can be actualized outside of time, somehow, there is no reason to think this couldn't go back infinitely. As I said, yes, it's unintuitive, but that's not relevant. That there must be a first is an assumption that isn't warranted.
Remember, this is exactly the type of chain which is not allowed to regress forever, a vertical chain ordered per se. Eventually, we must hit on something which doesn't require appeal to a previous member.
Why? It's cute to keep asserting, but it's just assumptions, not supported by anything.
Something that is just purely actual. It is logically inescapable.
Actually, it's very escapable by the mere fact that you fail to justify your assumptions.
And once you arrive at the pure act, or the actus purus in Latin, a whole host of conclusions logically follow.
And since they clearly aren't going to provide evidence supporting their assumption, let's grant it. This is all hypothetical if one day they manage to show this. Let's see if I agree that if their assumptions were correct, that the following conclusions can be drawn.
The actus purus is 1. For there to be more than one such actualizer, there would have to be something that one has that the other doesn't. If literally every aspect about the actualizers was the same, then they'd just be one identical thing. In other words, you can't differentiate two things unless they have unactualized potentials.
Hold up. You said yourself that a potential isn't anything. Only something it has the potential for. A match does not have the potential to be on the moon.
When we say potential, we don't mean literally every conceivable thing that could happen.
A match doesn't inherently have the potential to fly to the moon, although you could give it that potential by strapping it to a spaceship, and that potential would then be actualized by the rockets, which are actual.
What if actus purus A and actus purus B don't have the potential to be each other? Congratulations, you now have two actus puruses without any potential, only actual.
But we have already shown that the actus purus cannot have any potency, so the actus purus is 1. The actus purus is changeless. Remember that change is just the actualizing of a potential, but the actus purus doesn't have any potency. This also means that the actus purus can neither come into being nor pass out of it, since these are just types of change, so the actus purus is changeless.
This one I agree with, simply because it's defined to be correct. The actus purus is defined as not having the ability to change. So it can't change, because if it had the ability to change, it by definition wouldn't be an actus purus.
The actus purus is outside of time. Existing inside time implies changeability, but the actus purus cannot change.
Time is just another dimension. Just like you can move through space, you can move through time. We actually do this all the time. Now we can only go forward in time, though forward is pretty made up here, and even that is questionable. We know the universe is expanding spatially. Perhaps what we experience as time moving forward is simply the expansion of space in the dimension of time. To not change would mean not to change position, spatially or temporally. And once more, I have to return to virtual particles. From the Wikipedia page on quantum fluctuations. Vacuum fluctuations appear as virtual particles, which are always created in particle-antiparticle pairs. Since they are created spontaneously without a source of energy, vacuum fluctuations and virtual particles are said to violate the conservation of energy. This is theoretically allowable because the particles annihilate each other within the time limit determined by the uncertainty principle, so they are not directly observable. Now, if I read this correctly, they appear to exist for the shortest time possible. So short that it falls within the uncertainty physics requires. Could this not be a single position in time? And because in no change of time there would also be no change in position, does this not make each and every virtual particle that make up quantum fluctuations an actus purus? Do they ever stop existing? I mean, we don't see them anymore, but if they have a single position in space-time, if we could observe that one time, would they not exist there forever? Now this is just me speculating like a madman at 1:30 AM, but it's just something to think about.
As we have seen before, it is also eternal since it cannot come in or out of being, so the actus purus is outside of time. The actus purus is immaterial. Materiality implies changeability.
It's just asserted that materiality implies changeability. No justification is given when it's severely needed. Let's return to my actus purus virtual particles that exist in a single position in spacetime. Material, but without change. But that do change other things, as many forces in physics, as far as we know, work because of quantum fluctuations, which are made of virtual particles.
But the actus purus cannot change, so the actus purus is immaterial. The actus purus is perfect. Whenever we say something is imperfect, we mean that there is some unactualized potential remaining in a thing.
Here, they play with the definition of perfect. The best cake possible isn't perfect with this definition, as it still has the potential to, for instance, be burned. It's given a normal word, perfect, an unorthodox definition, lacking the ability to change. This is saying nothing other than that it's changeless, again. But this has the potential to be the perfect setup for an equivocation fallacy. Pun intended.
But the actus purus has no potency, so the actus purus is perfect. The actus purus is all good. Grant that evil or badness is just a privation, that is, a lack of good. All evil or bad things are defective in some sense, short of what is needed to be counted good. For example, a liar's speech is deficient in the truth. Aristotle goes deeper into this in his Nicomachean Ethics. But the actus purus is perfect and does not lack.
The actus purus does lack. In fact, it's defined by what it lacks. It lacks potential. I didn't even know what they were going to do when writing this, but how I worded their definition of perfect was lacking the ability to change. Or let's use their own wording when talking about how it's changeless.
But the actus purus doesn't have any potency. We are saying that this first member must lack potency. We are saying that this first member must lack potency. So the actus purus is all good. The actus purus is all powerful. To have power means to be able to change things or to actualize potencies. The more things you are able to change, the more power you have. But as we have seen, if we regress far enough, all causal chains must ultimately terminate at the actus purus.
Since I gave reason why there can be more than one actus purus, actually seeing reason to say that quantum fluctuations are made of actus puruses, meaning that we have near infinite actus puruses each second, this of course also doesn't follow. A near infinite amount of actus puruses mean that no one of them has all the power.
Therefore, the actus purus is the ultimate cause of all effects, so the actus purus is all powerful. The actus purus is rational. According to the principle of proportionate causality, what is in an effect is in the cause in some way. For example, if the effect is fire, then the cause must either be fire itself or the ability to cause fire, such as friction. Since the actus purus is the ultimate cause of all effects, there is in some way in which what is in all effects must be in the actus purus.
The best I can find when looking for the principle of proportional causality is the proposition of universal causation, which is an axiom. It claims to be so obvious that no support is needed, and I don't accept axioms, simply because I know too much of physics and how human reason, the thing obviousness is based on, doesn't comprehend things we can show are true. And even the proposition of universal causation doesn't match with what's on screen. I have searched the internet for the principle. It doesn't appear to exist. Now, I'm not saying they made this up. I'm just saying I didn't find any evidence to falsify that hypothesis. And I looked. This is also the fallacy of composition. Because something is true of its parts doesn't mean it's true of the whole. Lego bricks are small, so everything built from Lego is also small. It also fails to take emergence into account. The actual of life is a potential of the atoms that make up life. But atoms are not alive. Atoms act purely by physics. No electron has a program in it, yet the movement of electrons is how my programs come to be. This is just blatantly false once you give it a thought. And to call it rational appears to be another setup for an equivocation fallacy.
They cannot exist in the actus purus concretely, since this would mean that many particular material things exist within a totally one and immaterial thing. So then what is in all effects must exist in the actus purus abstractly.
What does it mean to exist? Well, all things people agree exist have position in space-time, right? I'm here at present time. That's what it means for me to exist. Something outside of space and time doesn't exist by this. Abstract things also don't exist. Abstractions are things we make up. No abstract exists anywhere. If I'm wrong, please do show.
But abstracts can only exist in the mind, as when we conceive of treeness, catness, truth, the number 3, or any idea.
Exactly. Abstracts are ideas, not things that actually exist. An idea exists, of course. Ideas are changes in brain chemistry. We can see those happen with the right equipment. But what the idea is about doesn't exist. That's interpretation of neurochemical signals.
So then what is in all effects exists abstractly in the mind of the actus purus. So the actus purus is rational.
Since effects don't exist in the cause, this obviously doesn't follow. But do you see what they suddenly snuck in there? The mind of the actus purus. Additionally, a mind doesn't require rationality. Rational is how we make sense of the universe. The making sense of the universe is pretty much the definition of rational. Something that doesn't try to make sense of the universe is pretty much by definition not rational. This could have many reasons. Making sense of the universe is a process. Processes rely on change, and something that can't change can't undertake a process. Or, for instance, it's not in the universe and can't interact with the universe. Once more, because interaction is a process in space-time.
The actus purus is all-knowing. Since what is in all effects exists in the mind of the actus purus as we have seen, then there is nothing in the universe which can exist outside the range of that mind.
This relies on the rational point being sound, and since it's not, neither is this point.
But to say that nothing is outside the range of a mind is just to say that the mind is all-knowing, so the actus purus is all-knowing. So it has been demonstrated that there exists something which is pure act, lacking potency,
which of course has not been demonstrated. It's just been asserted without justification.
Totally one.
Oneness. Use their logic to show this not to be a warranted conclusion.
Changeless.
True by definition.
Outside of time.
Unwarranted. And led me to the conclusion virtual particles could all count as actus puruses.
Immaterial.
Unwarranted. And further supports my conclusion virtual particles are actus puruses.
Perfect.
Defined into being correct with a word redefinition of perfect.
All good.
False by the definition that an actus purus lacks potentials.
All powerful.
Because oneness cannot be concluded, neither can all powerful.
Rational.
Because this relies on a fallacy of composition, and forgetting emergence is a thing obviously not correct.
And all-knowing.
Relies on their previous points of rationality, which was their worst point. So obviously this point also doesn't stand.
But this is obviously just what we mean when we say God. So the actus purus is God. Therefore, God exists.
But since the existence of an actus purus isn't demonstrated, and most of the conclusions from the existence of an actus purus don't follow, we obviously can't get to God. Though I find it very fun that I can make a weird point, a weird argument, that the closest thing to God we have are virtual particles. Meaning that gods would be literally a dime a dozen. Actually, way worse.
Have we proven all of Christianity, or that Jesus is God here? Of course not, but that's an argument for another video.
And since you failed to prove anything, you've obviously not gotten closer to proving anything in Christianity either. Oh well, it was a good try, and the start of the video was pretty good. But apparently we can't use a Hellenistic philosopher to prove a god of a religion he didn't know about, as it didn't exist either yet. Probably didn't know about its pre-low either. So I guess the search for God continues. I have to say, Andalus, that was an interesting one to look at. Though, like I expected, quite a bit of overlap with my points around the Kalam. And the initial script only took me nearly 2 hours to write. This has been Vinix, saying farewell.